just never seen anything like it in my career, someone so high functioning who actually needs a conservator. It's highly, highly unusual. My name is Brandon Bieber. I'm a neurologist, and I'm going to comment on the Free Britney movement. And I'm going to talk about my own experiences dealing with conservatorships and how they compare to Britney Spears' situation. Now, just to be clear, I'm a neurologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I do not know Britney Spears. I have not examined her. I have no particular conflict of interest. I'm not a pop star fan. I don't listen to her music, nor am I an enemy of Britney Spears. I did watch the documentary, which comes to the conclusion that she should not be in the conservatorship, and I am going to come to that same conclusion, but I'm going to do so in a much less biased way, and I'm going to talk about my own experiences, and I'm also going to predict the outcome of the court case, and I'm going to analyze her testimony and explain the signs of mental illness that she does exhibit. Now, just to give a little background, Britney Spears is obviously a very successful pop star. She's estimated to have a net worth of $60 million as a pop singer. However, around 2008 and before that, she exhibited signs of mental illness. For example, she famously drove with her baby on her lap, which is quite dangerous. She also damaged the vehicle of a reporter. She has also been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons multiple times. Again, I don't know the entire details, but she is reported to have bipolar disorder. And I'm going to talk about whether or not that diagnosis makes sense in terms of her testimony in court. So because of her problems, her father ended up becoming her conservator, and that conservatorship was later made permanent. So basically, a conservatorship is sort of like the relationship of a parent to a child. So a child does not make their own medical decisions. The parents make that type of decision for them. So if a child doesn't want a medical treatment, it doesn't really matter. The parents can force them to do it. The parents can also make financial decisions for a child. If a child inherits money, the parents can invest that as they see fit. And that makes sense in our society because we know children, generally speaking, do not have the capacity to make certain types of complicated decisions, and it requires some maturity. And we've sort of agreed as a society that typically around age 18, people develop that level of maturity. And I want to talk about my experiences with conservatorships. So typically, conservatorships come into play in 3 different situations. One, which is probably the most common, is dementia. Someone gets older, they start to have declining cognitive function. At first, it may be mild, but eventually it gets to the point where they can no longer manage their activities of daily living. They can't really take their own medications or manage their own finances, and so they're no longer really competent to make healthcare decisions or to make financial decisions. It wouldn't even really be ethical for them to be signing paperwork to make financial decisions, and so it makes sense for a fiduciary to make those decisions for them. A lot of the times this is done informally, and demented people sign legal paperwork all the time and no one knows they're demented. But sometimes we actually do this in a formal way where someone, usually the child or other close relative whom they trust, becomes the conservator. And usually there's no conflict whatsoever because the child loves them and acts in their best interests, and there really aren't any problems. Now I'm going to talk about a few exceptions where I have seen controversies when it comes to decisional capacity. So another common situation is when a child is disabled and turns 18. Let's say there's a child with severe autism and intellectual disability, or a child that has a genetic disorder that causes a lot of cognitive impairment, cerebral palsy. The child, while they're collecting SSI as a child, the parents can manage that money and make all the decisions for them. But when they turn 18, it becomes a problem. The parents can't simply spend the SSI money and invest the SSI money, even if they're acting in good faith. And so it makes sense to actually get a legal conservatorship at that point. And this is something I've come across from time to time. And of course, we review the documentations and examine the patient and, make sure that we're making the right decision, because obviously it would be a disaster to put someone in a conservatorship who did not need it. The third scenario I see is an adult who has an acquired illness. So let's say there's a healthy adult who's 30 years old, but is in a serious car accident and has traumatic brain injury and now has permanent cognitive impairment and can no longer make decisions for themselves. It may be necessary for the parents to obtain a conservatorship. Now, I want to make a few comments on these scenarios. One is that Usually there's no serious conflict. The person being conserved is not objecting to it. Usually not. There are some cases where someone has dementia and they have poor insight and they're distrustful of their own relatives. That does happen, but usually it's crystal clear. A lot of the times the person with the incapacity is voluntarily choosing who will be their fiduciary. And like I said, usually it's the children or the parents, and they're sort of a natural fiduciary. It's someone that they're living with that's taking care of them anyways, that was sort of informally making all of the healthcare and financial decisions for them anyway, even if it wasn't legally put into writing. Now, like I said, there are scenarios where it will become contentious, and I want to talk about those and compare them to Britney Spears' situation. So one encounter I saw was an elderly woman who came to my clinic with complaints of cognitive impairment. She was in her 80s. And I assessed her, and she did in fact have some memory loss. She was forgetting things and misplacing things periodically, but she had preservation of her activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. In other words, she was capable of taking her own medications without forgetting or making excess errors, taking care of her finances, paying her bills, doing her own shopping, that kind of thing. Maybe she had some physical problems, so certain things were more difficult for her, but she could pretty much do everything on her own. She was also quite wealthy and owned several properties. One of these properties was very valuable and generated a large amount of income. Now, she was trying to get her affairs in order, and the reason she came to me in part was because she wanted it to be clear that she had decisional capacity to make her will or trust. Now, she had 3 children. 2 of them were very successful in their own right. They were independently wealthy, or at least upper middle class. One of them was sort of less successful. I don't remember the details, but I think he was still doing okay, but not as successful as his 2 siblings. And the patient herself, she wanted to will all of her assets equally to the 3 siblings. And she explained very clear why she wanted to do that. She thought that it was fair. She didn't want to give one person more than the other. She expressed very clearly and gave good reasons for why she wanted to do this. And it was very clear that she was not being manipulated in any way. However, the child who was less successful wanted the patient to will her the most valuable property. And it's because they didn't want to have to break up the properties, because this property was so valuable, it was like the majority of the state on its own. And this person felt that they were entitled to inheriting more simply because they had less. Anyways, I documented in my note very clearly that this person did not have dementia, even though there was some memory impairment, and she did have decisional capacity. So if there were ever a legal dispute, she would have very clear medical evidence that she had decisional capacity to make the decision and was not demented at the time of the decision. As far as I know, this never became a legal issue, and I was never called into court. And that's how it goes most of the time. I'll tell you about another situation that I had. I had a patient who was in his 50s with very severe multiple sclerosis. Now, most people with multiple sclerosis have decisional capacity and don't need a conservator. However, unfortunately, this gentleman had very severe cognitive impairment and had dementia due to multiple sclerosis. And his cognitive impairment was significant enough that he really was not qualified to make his own health care decisions or his own financial decisions at all. And he had a conservator who was his sister. However, he had another sibling, another sister, and they had a conflict. The other sister wanted to become the conservator. And the problem that was happening is that the current sister, who was the conservator, was sort of more conservative with money, wasn't really giving the individual a lot of money to spend. She was sort of very controlling. And the other sister was sort of a little bit more free-spirited and open, willing to give him more cash to spend on his own. And the patient himself, my patient, became dissatisfied. He wanted the other sister to be the conservator. Now, of course, from the outside looking in, I didn't really know these people. I don't know the details of their financial situation. As far as I know, he was not wealthy. He was living on modest means. It was difficult for me to judge whether or not the sister was spending too much money or too little money. Maybe she was being too controlling of his assets. Maybe he had very few assets and she was managing it in a reasonable way. I don't really know. But the point I'm trying to make is, despite being significantly cognitively impaired, I still felt that he had decisional capacity to make this specific decision. In other words, he wasn't able to manage his own finances. He wasn't able to manage his own healthcare, but he could give good reasons for saying why he wanted a specific conservator to manage his life for him. So presuming that there was no evidence that this other sister was up to no good, was mismanaging his money, I think he had the capacity to appoint the other sister as his conservator. And I don't know the result. This is an ongoing problem. I'm not sure if it's actually going to court or not. And I'm not sure what a judge would actually rule. It's obviously a difficult and close call. But the point I'm trying to make is this individual, this middle-aged person with multiple sclerosis and dementia, has infinitely less capacity than Britney Spears. Britney Spears is very high functioning. While being in this conservatorship, she was able to work long weeks, she was able to perform, and she was very successful. There are interviews of her during the conservatorship where she comes off as quite normal, well-spoken, and humorous, maybe a little bit awkward of times, but it would be almost absurd to look at her and say she needs to be conserved. She cannot manage her own affairs. And I've just never seen anything like it in my career, someone so high functioning who actually needs a conservator. It's highly, highly unusual. And as I said, there are tons of people out there who have dementia who are not conserved. They make their own decisions. They may not be good all the time. It may not be ideally, but probably a fairly low percentage of people with dementia are actually in a formal conservatorship. The same is true with people with bipolar disorder. There are tons of people with bipolar disorder, and they may not make good decisions at all times. They may be manic. They may blow a bunch of money. They may use drugs sometimes. But generally speaking, they're not in conservatorships unless they're profoundly impaired. Now, Britney states that the reason she wants out of the conservatorship is because she doesn't trust her dad. She thinks her dad is controlling her too much. She makes claims that her father is sort of forcing her to do certain things to get access to her own money in order to see her own boyfriend. She apparently wants to have another child, but she has an IUD in place, and so she doesn't even have the capacity to make the medical decision to remove the IUD so that she can get pregnant. She doesn't have the legal ability to do this on her own right now. Again, this is very unusual. People with bipolar disorder, even with psychosis, have children all the time, make financial decisions all the time. Now I want to talk about the other side of the story, and I want to talk about the testimony that Britney Spears gave in court. And so I listened to this testimony. It's about 30 minutes. It's audio only. And she really does exhibit quite clear signs of mental illness. And I'll talk about what I need. It's kind of funny to read the comments on the YouTube videos where everyone is, of course, part of the Free Britney Spears movement. So they're saying she did a great job and the conservatorship, Free Britney. But really, this testimony was a complete disaster. And I'll explain what I mean. One is she has a lot of signs that could be consistent with bipolar disorder. Again, I'm just speculating, not diagnosing anyone. One thing that she had is pressured speech. She's speaking very, very quickly and has great difficulty slowing down. The judge multiple times tells her, listen, we have a court reporter that's trying to type what you say. Please talk a little bit slower. And she just can't do it. She has a great difficulty slowing down. Another thing is, during part of the testimony, she appears to be reading from a written statement. And still, she cannot slow down. She's still talking a mile a minute, and she sort of interjects with her own spontaneous ideas. And she has what we would call a flight of ideas, where sort of loosely connected ideas just start coming to her randomly, and they're not that strongly connected. She just sort of interjects. And this is something that we see in people with a manic phase of bipolar disorder. Someone may say, like, I'm in great shape. I think I can run the marathon in under 3 hours. By the way, I'm going to invest in Tesla. No, Tesla's overvalued. I'm going to short it and make a lot of money. That kind of thing. They're just jumping from topic to topic. And she does that a little bit during her testimony. A lot of people with mania can have like an elevated affect. They can be fun and pleasant to be around. They can be very productive. And it's possible that this manic state or hypomanic state, if it's less severe, could be part of the reason that she's successful. A lot of people with hypomania are very successful. They're hyper productive. And she's a performer, so it's great to be energetic out there on stage. And there are a lot of famous people who have bipolar disorder. I have a close friend with bipolar disorder who's extremely successful, and I think this may be part of the reason that he's successful. However, when someone crosses from the hypomanic phase into the manic phase, they can have other symptoms. So you can have less sleep, which she kind of actually describes at one point. And also, you can become very irritable. And she definitely has a lot of irritability during her testimony. And she seems very impulsive. She curses at times during the testimony, which really shows another feature, which is poor insight and poor judgment. So one of the things you want to show if you have a mental illness, but you want to demonstrate capacity, is you want to show that you have insight into your mental illness. Now, she does say at one point during the testimony, I think that I need a little bit of therapy, even I know that, but she's not fully understanding the seriousness of her illness. She really is significantly impaired from this disease, no question about it. She mentions that her psychiatrist gave her lithium and she didn't want to take it, which may be reasonable. I mean, medications can have side effects, but she seems to have no insight into her diagnosis whatsoever. She's complaining that she doesn't want to see a therapist more than once a week. She doesn't want to be independently evaluated. These are just not things that a person with good judgment would say in order to get out of the conservatorship. If I were in her situation, I would be like, hey, I'd love to be independently evaluated so that you can see that I have capacity and I don't need to be conserved. I'm happy to do any amount of therapy. I'll do therapy daily if that's what's needed to convince this court that I have capacity. I wouldn't complain about anything. I would take my medication as scheduled. I would show good judgment and good insight. And she's not really doing that. And it kind of gives the impression that some of her criticism of Jamie, or her father, could be a little bit delusional. So it's hard to know what's going on behind the scenes. One thing that's possible is that everything she's saying is true, and that her father is this evil monster. But another possibility is that Jamie is acting totally rationally and only in Britney's best interest. Maybe he's concerned about her. He doesn't want her to get pregnant. He doesn't think she would be a fit mother at this point with her current mental state. Maybe he doesn't think she would be responsible in managing her finances. Maybe he thinks she would embarrass herself publicly and ruin her career and cause other personal problems. And in fact, parents are often looking out for her children in ways that other people cannot be. And, some of her claims about how he's abusive to her and how he's doing it all for the money, this may be a little bit fanciful. And she kind of goes on and on about this, saying that he shouldn't get away with it and he should have legal consequences. I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical. But the tiebreaker here is sort of the nature of her requests. Is Britney Spears asking for something reasonable? My understanding is that her lawyer is not necessarily trying to get her completely emancipated. Rather, she's just trying to get her father to not be her conservator and have someone independent. And one potential candidate would be an independent company that is experienced in managing things like special needs trusts. And I heard that Bessemer is a potential candidate company. And potentially they do this all the time and deal with similar situations where there's an elderly parent trying to set up a special needs trust for a disabled or mentally ill child. This sort of thing happens all the time. And when people don't get along, this is a totally reasonable solution. It's just not practical to have someone be your conservator when you hate their guts and you are extremely unsatisfied, even if to some extent your criticisms of them could be a little bit irrational. And after all, many of the criticisms Britney has of her father and her conservatorship in general are totally reasonable. She's complaining that she feels controlled, she can't do anything, she can't even have a child. People with bipolar disorder and psychosis have children all the time, all the time. No one would ever say a mentally ill person cannot have a child, particularly as someone as independent, as successful as Britney Spears. Certainly she has the means. She could get help if she's not fit on her own to take care of the child. Even if she were hospitalized for psychiatric reasons or became completely incapacitated, probably the child will be fine. There will be around her all the time anyway. She makes very specific criticisms of her father, saying that she was pressured into performing in Las Vegas when she didn't want to do it. She felt too stressed out. He often forces her to not see her boyfriend or not see her friends unless she complies with his wishes and things like that. So she has very, very reasonable criticisms. When I put it all together, I think it would be highly unusual for her to be forced to stay with a conservator that she does not want. Now, this gets to the point of the idea of decisional capacity. Is the judge going to rule that she has decisional capacity to make all of her own financial decisions? I think based on this testimony, the answer would be no. She really does show poor insight and poor judgment. So no judge would rule that, I don't think. And that wouldn't be reasonable, but nor is that what her attorney is asking for. Also, she asks that she doesn't want to be evaluated again by an independent psychiatrist. Again, that's an unreasonable request. When people are asking to make a major legal change, it's fair to ask for an evaluation. Maybe it's even fair to say, hey, she has to do therapy with a certain frequency during the transition time. However, to say that she doesn't even have the decisional capacity to appoint a conservator, or to say this one person I dislike cannot be my conservator, seems completely absurd to me. Again, people with significantly less capacity do this all the time. Take, for example, my middle-aged patient with multiple sclerosis and dementia. He has much less capacity than Britney Spears, but in my opinion still has the capacity to say, hey, I prefer this conservator over another. And hiring a professional management company to be your conservator is very reasonable. Also, I should point out that there is pretty significant financial gain on the part of Jamie. So apparently the amount that he was asking for was $2,000 for a month for an office and $18,000 a month compensation. So that's $20,000 a month and $240,000 a year. That really is a lot of money to manage someone's finances. For example, she could hire me for $240,000 a year, and I'll tell you exactly what I'll do. I'll take her $60 million fortune, and I'll invest it entirely in target date funds from Vanguard or Fidelity or whatever, and I'll take 1.5% of that and set up her personal expenses like her mortgage on her home and all her day-to-day expenses, and then I'll just give her the other 1.5% in cash, which by the way is $900,000 per year, and she would have a 3% withdrawal rate, no chance of going broke whatsoever. She'd be completely fine. She could literally blow $900,000 a year on diamonds and Louis Vuittons, and it would make no difference. She would be completely fine. She could literally have a manic psychotic episode and spend all that money in one day, and it really wouldn't be a big deal. So you really can't go wrong here. Now, hopefully she can set up some sort of situation where she has a little bit of help with someone she trusts to help make her personal decisions. But anyways, that's sort of my input. Now, in terms of how the judge will actually rule, unfortunately, I'm actually going to predict that the judge will rule in favor of her father. I've seen a few of these legal battles when I was in medical school with people with bipolar disorder. And typically when someone presents very poorly and has poor insight into their medical condition and poor judgment, typically they don't get a favorable ruling. And usually I've seen this in the case of an inpatient psychiatric hold. So I'm going to go ahead and predict that the judge will rule against her. I think it's the wrong decision. I think she does have, in my opinion, based on what I could see, there could be other things that I don't know, she seems to have the decisional capacity at least to reject a particular conservator that she doesn't like. But I'd love to know your thoughts. What do you think about the case, and what is your prediction for the final outcome of the court case?